Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So the most sought-after job in Manhattan right now might be the job of being Manhattan's next top prosecutor. Manhattan DA Cy Vance has chosen not to run for re-election, leaving 8 candidates, yes, I said 8 candidates vying to take his place. Under Vance's leadership, however, the Manhattan DA's office has had a reputation for being regressive, for rubber stamping and prosecuting essentially every case brought to it by the NYPD. That's according to analysis by the Vera Institute of Justice. Black New Yorkers are disproportionately impacted at every level of the system, and that includes being 20% more likely to be detained pretrial, in other words, held in jail without being convicted of anything, when prosecuted by Cy Vance's Manhattan DA office. But that could change this year, because all of the candidates who are vying for the seat seem to have sensed a sea change. They seem to have caught wind of a public demand for a different kind of prosecutor. And all 8 have presented themselves as some version of smart on crime or progressive. But there are key differences in the policy promises they are making. And those differences define for voters who they will be and what makes them unique as a candidate. In other words, it's those differences that are most critical for you, if you're a Manhattan voter, to understand when you head to the polls later this year. So today we're pleased to speak with Lucy Lang, a career prosecutor who worked in the Manhattan DA's office for 12 years before moving in 2018 to direct the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College. Ms. Lang, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
So let's start with the basic question. What would be the biggest distinction between the Cy Vance administration and yours?
I'll give you just 3. First, that I take it as a stated objective of the district attorney's office to be an engine for dismantling mass incarceration. The office has been an engine that has got us to this place and must also be part of dismantling it. A second distinction is that I intend to build a survivor-centered sex crimes unit. I'm proud to have worked alongside survivors of sexual abuse by Harvey Weinstein to build a plan for a revamped sex crimes unit that is fully resourced and puts the needs of survivors first. I also, from the day I launched the campaign, have committed to an equal access policy so that no matter who someone is or who their lawyer may be, there will be no backroom meetings between the district attorney and senior staff and private defense attorneys.
So I want to tease out some of these differences, as I mentioned at the top. And one of the things that I'm hearing that's interesting is we've had several people on the show who've talked about making the office smaller, moving towards community restoration. And actually many of your peers have committed to declining to prosecute lists of offenses. And my understanding is that you haven't actually made any categorical commitment on declining to prosecute certain offenses. Is that correct? And can you explain your position on this?
I'm committed to declining to prosecute crimes of poverty like sleeping on a park bench or taking up multiple seats on the subway or urinating in public. Those cases don't belong in any system. What I have proposed with respect to substance misuse and mental health challenges is that the district attorney assist in creating pathways into other agencies, including public health systems and clinicians, so that people, without being prosecuted, are able to get the services that they need. So it is different than an outright decline to prosecute approach that would say, I intend to turn a blind eye to this set of issues, and instead says, I will use as the sole elected agency head the bully pulpit of this office to make sure that there are pathways for New Yorkers who are suffering to receive the services that they need. That also accomplishes the goal of shrinking the criminal justice footprint while delivering services to New Yorkers.
So just to drill down a little bit on what you mean by the district attorney assisting. As a former criminal defense attorney myself, very often when DAs saw themselves as providing assistance to my client, it was done so with the threat of jail, as in do this treatment program, and if you succeed, you get a favorable disposition, and if you don't succeed, you go to Rikers. Is that what you mean by assistance? Is there I'm looking for something that defines declining to prosecute versus assisting, and what you mean by that, and how prosecutorial that is.
It is not at all the notion of holding the possibility of detention over someone's head. It's simply getting the relevant agency heads together to determine what is going to happen when emergency responders respond to a situation where a person is in a mental health crisis. And instead of saying, we'll get this person to the precinct or the courthouse and then assess, saying we are going to make sure that the police understand that there are clinical offerings that can be made available to someone, and that those will not be withdrawn simply because someone doesn't comply with the terms. It really is a moving towards a Portuguese model of responding, for example, to substance misuse.
So I've been making every candidate who comes on here totally talk in lay terms. And Portuguese model, I know what you're talking about, but can you define for our audience what you mean by that?
It is a public health approach to substance misuse. It recognizes that addiction is a disease, not a crime, and that especially in the wake of the pandemic, when we see increasing rates of substance misuse in New York, that people are in need of treatment rather than in need of detention.
So just to make sure I understand, you are saying that you're not declining to prosecute drug possession, but you are willing to help create pre-arrest diversion to send people through NYPD to other services?
It functionally operates like declining to prosecute, but is seeking to exercise a leadership role in collaboration with community-based resources and other public agencies to ensure that people are brought somewhere where they receive the supports that they need.
Okay. All right, so turning for a second to the existing prison population. If elected, you are taking the helm of an office that has been prosecuting thousands of primarily Black and brown New Yorkers every year, sending people to prison for decades. Just last year, half of the Black New Yorkers convicted by Cy Vance's office were sentenced to incarceration, and that's down. That's actually lower than 80% of the Black New Yorkers that Cy Vance prosecuted in 2013, and that's according to the office's own data. So I want to know, how do you intend to reduce existing prison populations and bring people home?
I've spent the past number of years teaching in New York State's prisons, a class that I created to bring assistant district attorneys inside prison to work on justice reform issues alongside incarcerated New Yorkers and together collaborate to develop reforms. In that role, I have heard time and time again about the incredible difficulties of the excessive sentences that people are facing. So one of the pieces of the retroactive review unit that I have laid out on my website alongside 25 other comprehensive policy plans for change is a piece of that unit that, in addition to looking at cases where there's potential for wrongful conviction, we'll look back at cases where the sentences are simply excessive by contemporary standards and seek to undo that. That may be leveraging the new domestic violence survivors law. It may include clemency appeals to the governor, and it certainly will include expungement and sealing of cases that are no longer being prosecuted because they're no longer consistent with existing public mores.
So in terms of parole, will your office be supporting the grants of parole?
We will.
Okay. I want to ask you one really quick question. I'm going to try so hard to keep this lay level because it's such a wonky question. But conviction review units always speak to me about a desire to have a second look at sentences. That's what we're talking about, is getting a second look at sentences that have already been meted out. And I'm wondering if your office will continue a practice that's very common in New York, which is asking people when they plead guilty to waive their right to appeal. In other words, to give up their chance to have another court look at their case. If your office is behind second looks, will you be ending the process of asking people to give up that appellate review?
We will end the practice of categorically requiring a waiver of appeal in order to enter a guilty plea.
I love a straightforward, I love a straightforward answer like that. That's great. Thank you. All right. So turning now to jury trials. So I began my practice as a public defender in California, where everybody gets a jury trial pretty much all the time. And when I moved to New York, I almost fell off the floor when I learned that prosecutors would do this thing where they would charge someone with a misdemeanor. And then right before we would go to trial, they would change that charge to change to a lower level misdemeanor to avoid letting that person have the right to a jury trial. Because in New York, A-level misdemeanors, you get a jury trial. B-level misdemeanors, you don't. You only get what's called a bench trial with a judge. And as a lawyer who loves juries and loves, civilian review of what's happening in the court system, that was really shocking to me. I'm wondering if you are elected DA, will you let everyone have a jury trial, or will you continue letting line DAs dodge the people of Manhattan?
Like you, I view the right to a jury trial as sacrosanct, if, of course, imperfect. And while there may be cases where both parties agree that it's appropriate to reduce a charge for purposes of a bench trial, I will not continue the practice of the prosecutor unilaterally doing that.
Again, thank you for the straightforward and clear answer. I appreciate that. So I'm interested in your position now on pretrial detention, because every candidate in this race is talking about stepping away from cash bail, ending cash bail. We've seen in New York great progress on cash bail that got rolled back a little bit. And I'm sort of wondering how you will ensure, if you're the head of the office, there's hundreds of DAs working for you, and those line DAs are the ones who are actually in the arraignment courtrooms every day and every night. How would you ensure that those line DAs are sending as many people as possible home to their families?
I believe in ending the use of cash bail. I'm inspired by my friend and endorser, Sarah Fair George in Chittenden, Vermont, who was only the second district attorney nationally to voluntarily end the reliance on cash bail. It requires an investment from the district attorney in community-based resources and supportive release so that people are able to wait out their day in court in their communities and receive the services that they need. I will make it an outright policy that line assistants follow those protocols, and will work closely with community-based organizations to provide the kind of supports that people need to successfully remain in their communities, if they need such supports while they're awaiting their day in court.
So I'm interested when we talk about support, because in a world without cash bail, we're left with a few options. We've got, remand, which is when prosecutors ask that somebody be held with no option to be released through any means. And then I'm wondering what you mean by supportive release, because I can think of supervised release, where somebody is sort of in a probation-like situation where they have to check in with an officer of the court routinely in order to stay at liberty while their case is pending. Would you be increasing the use of remand or supervised release while stepping away from cash bail?
What I mean when I talk about supportive release is innovative community-based models. So that includes things like identifying, training, and funding credible messengers who can serve as peer navigators, and pairing people in court at release from arraignment with someone who can make sure that they remember their court date, who can make sure that if there is a term of their release that they're complying with it. And that's a person who is from the community, who may have justice involvement themselves, and who can help the person charged navigate the system, not from a lawyerly standpoint, because of course the person charged has their defense attorney for that purpose, but to make sure that they actually receive community-based support. So it is different from supervised release, which we have on a small scale here in Manhattan. And that, of course, can range from parole-like visits to text message reminders. This really could potentially involve the pairing of a person charged with a true community-based organization and the people who fuel those organizations to actually provide real on-the-ground supports so someone is able to remain at home during the pendency of their case.
So I hear you about the value of innovative community-based programs and like really stuff that's really in the community and not part of the sort of criminal legal system. I guess that leads me to an interesting question, which is that some of the other candidates in the race are interested in defunding themselves, reducing funding for the DA's office in order to route that funding to what you're talking about, innovative community-based organizations that may prove more restorative or effective for public safety then prosecution. Are you prepared to use any portion of your budget to reroute that funding towards the kind of innovative community programs you're talking about?
Absolutely.
Great. So let's turn now to prosecutorial groups. The DA's Association of New York, it is something that most people have not heard of, but as we saw a number of reforms come up in Albany that were sort of fairness oriented, bail reform, discovery reform, one of the primary opponents of that reform and one of the biggest obstacles to reform in Albany has been the New York DA's Association. If elected, would you pull the Manhattan DA's office out of the association?
Emily, I believe in making change from inside institutions in order to have massive social impact. That's why I'm running for district attorney. I am willing to work from inside the District Attorneys Association to expand and scale the reforms that New Yorkers are calling for to other jurisdictions in the state. And if the rest of the District Attorneys Association is an obstacle to that, I'm prepared to withdraw. But I do believe in working collaboratively. And were there an alternative, such as the outstanding new organization Prosecutor Alliance that was formed in California for progressive-minded district attorneys' offices, I would happily join that organization.
Would you start such an organization?
Oh, Emily, you're asking me to do so much all at once.
It's a big job. It's the Manhattan DA. I got to ask you how much you're willing to do.
I think that the potential for such an organization is incredibly exciting. That organization was started by not by a district attorney, him or herself, but by a group of separate individuals, which I think is probably a better practice, but I certainly would look at it.
So, final topic, policing. New Yorkers have had to take a really hard look at their police in the last year. Of course, the NYPD is an institution with a long history of misconduct going back decades before 2020. But the summer of 2020, we saw videos of like police driving vehicles into crowds. We saw really, really disturbing things. And of course, you know, as someone who's worked in the system, I know that there's a lot of invisible misconduct too. There's testifying where police will perjure themselves on the stand. There's other sort of quieter forms of misconduct. So what would you do as DA to protect New Yorkers from bad policing?
I have the incredible honor of having worked alongside families who lost loved ones to police violence to create a set of protocols for how prosecutors can ensure accountability in instances of police violence and misconduct. And I'm proud to have the endorsement of Sean Bell's mother, Valerie Bell, Philando Castile's mother, Valerie Castile, and Delron Small's sister, Victoria Davis, for the work that we did together to inform a plan for police accountability that includes not just responses to egregious incidents, but also front-end interventions to seek to change the culture of policing. That includes tracking the kind of adverse credibility findings that you're describing. It includes internal tracking when an assistant district attorney disbelieves of something that a police officer has said or done. And it includes equipping assistant district attorneys to push back when there is a sense that the police are behaving in a way that is not consistent with their obligation to the community. And all of those things are spelled out at votelucylang.com. I hope that people will take an opportunity to look through that and the many other plans that I have laid out in collaboration with communities most impacted by the criminal justice system to describe how we are going to be able, as we emerge from the pandemic, to build a criminal justice system that is premised on safety, equity, and most importantly, on the dignity of everyone the system touches.
So assuming that some people are only going to watch this episode and not click, I know how hard it is to get people to click stuff. So let's go for just a second before I let you go tactically into what you're talking about. When you talk about empowering line DAs to take action when an officer lies on the stand, I want to know, does that mean you're relying entirely on line DAs to identify misconduct, or would you be seeking that information through defense attorneys and citizens? And two, what do you do with that information? Do you create do not call lists? Do you prosecute police? Are you going to create an independent unit in your office to focus on prosecuting cops?
Yes to all of the above. I have laid out a plan for a built out public corruption unit, and that would include investigation into official misconduct or police misconduct, as well as investigation into public integrity matters, which is to say investigation into public officials and the like. So with respect to investigations in police, I will make sure that there are full-time assistant district attorneys who don't work alongside the police, who have the full resources of the public corruption unit at their disposal, who are able to both complete investigations when there are allegations of misconduct, but also who are vested with the authority to gather information, not just from line assistants, but from judges, from defense attorneys, and from the community, and to track, look for trends, and seek to intervene and end the practice of calling officers who have a history of misconduct or untruthfulness, and to ensure that there is appropriate accountability for police across the board.
Does accountability look like prosecution? Like, would you, for example, be bringing perjury prosecutions against police?
Where there is evidence of perjury, yes.
Okay. Well, Lucy Lang, thank you so much for enduring this grilling. I really appreciate your being here. I appreciate you coming on the show, and I wish you the best of luck.
You can cross-examine me anytime, Emily. Pleasure being here.
This wasn't a cross, but if it ever, I hope it never comes to that. Never make me cross-examine you.
Absolutely not. I'll see you in court.
Take care. So there you have it. Another candidate for Manhattan DA, Lucy Lang, one of the 8 running to replace Cy Vance. We are going to be interviewing every one of these candidates. So if you want to take some time to sit down and just binge watch 20 minutes per candidate, you can do that here on The Appeal Live. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.